I stood in the middle of my brother's wedding reception, bald, humiliated, with 200 people staring at me like I was some kind of circus act. My own mother had just shaved my head, in public, while laughing. Why? Because I refused to hand over the keys to my $2.5 million loft, the home I built, with 20 years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. They said it belonged to the family, that I owed them, that a woman like me, 48, single, childless, didn't deserve success. So they took my hair instead. My father stood there smiling. My brother looked away. The guests pulled out their phones to record my destruction. But here's what they didn't know. I wanted them to go that far. Because when those chapel doors burst open 30 seconds later, everything changed. The smile vanished from my father's face. My mother's hands started shaking. And my brother realized he'd just helped destroy the wrong person. This is the story of how my family tried to take everything from me and how I made sure they lost everything instead. Stay with me, because what happened next, nobody saw coming. My name is Grace Miller. I'm 48 years old, and for the past 2 decades, I've built a successful career as an interior designer in New York City. I live alone in a loft in Soho that I bought with my own money, every single dollar of it, earned through late nights, difficult clients, and years of proving myself in an industry that doesn't forgive mistakes. I've never been married. I don't have children. And, according to my family, that makes me a failure. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon slipped between a stack of fabric samples and a client proposal. Cream-coloured cardstock, expensive letterpress. Printing my brother Ethan's name embossed in gold next to someone called Melissa Chen. I hadn't even known he was engaged. I should have thrown it away right then. Should have recognised the feeling creeping up my spine, that old familiar dread that came with anything involving my family. But I opened it anyway, and that's when I saw the note tucked inside. It was written on my mother's personal stationery, the kind she used for thank you notes and passive-aggressive letters to distant relatives. Just 4 words in her precise, careful handwriting. Bring the keys, Grace. No, dear Grace. No explanation. No question mark that might have made it sound like a request instead of a command. I sat down at my drafting table, the invitation trembling slightly in my hands. The keys. She meant the keys to this loft. The home I'd spent 20 years creating, the space I'd designed from exposed brick and raw potential into something beautiful. The place where I'd built my life after they made it clear I had no place in theirs. Why would she want my keys? I stared at those 4 words until they blurred, and suddenly I was 12 years old again, standing in my parents' kitchen in that small Pennsylvania town, holding up my report card, straight A's, just like always. My mother had glanced at it and said, "That's nice, dear," before turning to my younger brother Ethan. "Now tell me about your soccer game, sweetheart." My father hadn't even looked up from his newspaper. It was always like that. I could achieve anything and any accolade, work twice as hard, and it was never enough. Meanwhile, Ethan just had to exist to be celebrated. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" became the soundtrack of my childhood. Ethan was social. Ethan was fun. Ethan knew how to make people feel comfortable. And what was I? Too serious, too focused on, too ambitious in a way that made relatives uncomfortable at family gatherings. When I left for college, my parents acted like I was abandoning them. When I stayed in New York after graduation, my mother told everyone I thought I was too good for small-town life. And when I bought this loft at 28, scraping together every penny I'd saved working 3 jobs to make the down payment, my father showed up for exactly 1 visit. I still remember what he said standing in the middle of my empty living room, looking around at the space I was so proud of. He shook his head slowly and said, "No one wants a woman who builds walls instead of a family, Grace." I hadn't cried in front of him. I waited until he left. But those words stayed with me, carved themselves into my bones deeper than any of the casual cruelties that came before. Now holding this wedding invitation with its cryptic demand, I felt that same knot forming in my stomach, the one that appeared whenever my family wanted something from me. I set the invitation down carefully on my desk and picked up my phone. My mother answered on the third ring. "Hello, Grace," she said, her voice cool and measured, always so controlled. "Mum, I got the invitation." "Good. Then you saw my note." "I saw it. I just don't understand it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice had an edge I couldn't quite place. "We'll discuss it at the wedding. You're coming, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question. I looked around my loft at the exposed brick I'd carefully restored, at the custom shelving I designed, at the life I'd built in this space that was entirely mine. Then I looked back at those 4 words on my mother's note. So that's what this wedding is really about. I whispered more to myself than to her. "What did you say?" My mother's voice sharpened on the other end of the line. I hadn't meant for her to hear me. I straightened in my chair, gripping the phone tighter. I asked what the wedding is really about, Mum. "Why do you want my keys?" The silence stretched long enough that I thought she might have hung up. Then she spoke, and her voice had that particular tone I remembered from childhood, the one she used when delivering verdicts disguised as concern. "That loft should belong to this family, Grace. You just forgot where you came from." The words hit me like a physical blow, but it was the way she said them that made my skin prickle. Cold. Rehearsed. Like she'd practiced the line multiple times before picking up the phone. And underneath that carefully controlled delivery, I heard something else. Something that didn't fit. Her voice trembled, just slightly, but enough that I noticed. My mother never trembled. She was the woman who could silence a room with a look, who commanded church committees and charity boards with effortless authority. Fear wasn't part of her vocabulary. "Where I came from," I repeated slowly. "I came from a family that made it very clear I didn't belong. A family that celebrated every accomplishment of Ethan's while treating mine like they were somehow embarrassing. Don't be dramatic." "I'm not being dramatic. I'm being honest, and you still haven't answered my question. Why do you want the keys to my home?" I heard muffled sounds in the background. My father's voice low and urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. He was giving her instructions. "Your father helped you buy that place," my mother said, and now her voice sounded stronger, like she'd found her footing again. "He co-signed that loan when no bank would give you the time of day. You were 28 years old with barely any credit history. You would have nothing without his help." The memory surfaced unbidden. I'd been so excited, so proud. I'd found the perfect loft in Soho, a raw space in a converted factory building priced just within reach if I stretched every financial muscle I had. But the bank wanted a co-signer for a loan that size. Someone with established credit, with assets, with the kind of financial history I hadn't had time to build yet. I'd called my father nervous, but hopeful. To my surprise, he'd agreed immediately. "Of course, I'll help," he had said. "That's what family does." It was one of the few times in my adult life I'd felt like maybe, just maybe, he was proud of me. He'd come to New York with a briefcase full of documents. "I had our attorney draw everything up," he'd explained. "It'll be faster this way. Trust me, Grace, you don't want to get bogged down in bank bureaucracy." I'd been so grateful, so eager to move forward, that I'd signed every page he'd marked with those little yellow tabs. A thick stack of papers that I'd barely glanced at because I trusted him. The sick feeling that had been brewing in my stomach since I'd seen my mother's note suddenly intensified. What exactly had I signed? "Grace, are you listening to me?" I realised my mother had been talking, but I hadn't heard a word. "What?" I said, "We need to discuss this properly. At the wedding. The family attorney will be there." "The family attorney." I stood up, pacing across my loft. "Why would a family attorney need to be at Ethan's wedding?" More muffled voices in the background. My father again, speaking to someone else now. I strained to hear, pressing the phone harder against my ear. "She'll have to sign." My father's voice faint but distinct. "The lawyers will handle it." Another voice, older, unfamiliar. My pulse quickened. Mom, whose dad talking to a bus? No one. He's on another call. She was lying. I'd heard enough of my mother's lies growing up to recognise the slight rise in pitch, the way her words came, just a fraction too quickly. I don't understand what's happening here, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But whatever you and Dad are planning, you need to tell me now. This is my home we're talking about, my life. Everything will be explained at the wedding. Her voice had gone flat distant. Just bring the keys, Grace. It's important. Important to who? She didn't answer that. Instead, I heard a deep breath on her end of the line, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper. The careful control was gone. What remained sounded raw, desperate. Don't make me do something I'll regret, Grace. Please. The line went dead before I could respond. I stood there in the middle of my loft, phone still pressed to my ear, trying to understand what had just happened. My mother's final words echoed in my head, and for the first time since opening that invitation, I felt something close to real fear. Don't make me do something I'll regret. What did that mean? What were they planning to do? I left for Pennsylvania on Friday morning, giving myself plenty of time before Saturday's ceremony. The drive from Manhattan should have been relaxing, a chance to clear my head and prepare myself for whatever was coming. Instead, every mile felt like travelling backward through time, each exit sign pulling me closer to a version of myself I'd spent 20 years trying to leave behind. The landscape changed gradually as I drove west. The density of the city gave way to suburbs, then to stretches of highway, bordered by trees just beginning to turn with early autumn colour. By the time I crossed into Pennsylvania, the terrain had shifted to rolling hills and farmland small towns connected by two-lane roads where everyone drove 10 miles under the speed limit. This part of the state was poor in a way that New York money couldn't quite comprehend. Not the dramatic poverty that made headlines, but the quiet, grinding kind, shuttered factories' main streets, with more empty storefronts than open ones' houses that needed paint jobs their owners couldn't afford. The kind of place where a family's reputation was currency because actual currency was scarce. My parents had always been big fish in this small pond. My father owned Miller Hardware and Supply, one of the few businesses in town that had survived the economic downturns. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and in a place like this, steady meant respect. My mother had parlayed that respectability into social status, running the women's club at church, organising charity drives, serving on the hospital auxiliary board. The Miller name meant something here. I'd never fit into that world. Even as a child, I'd felt like a foreign object in my own family, too ambitious for a place that valued staying put, too questioning, for a community that prized conformity. The church parking lot was already filling when I arrived Saturday afternoon. First Baptist, the largest church in town, the one where everyone who was anyone got married. I sat in my car for a moment watching families stream toward the entrance in their Sunday best. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a tailored navy suit, elegant but understated, paired with low heels. My hair cut in a short modern style that cost more than most people here spent on groceries in a month was perfect. I looked every inch the successful city professional. I also looked completely out of place. The whispers started the moment I walked through the door. I heard them rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat heads, turning words hidden behind hands and programs. That's her. That's the daughter. The single one with the fancy apartment in the city. I heard she doesn't even want children. Can you imagine? She always thought she was too good for this town. An older woman I vaguely recognised from my childhood actually stepped back as I passed, as if my life choices might be contagious. I held my head high and kept walking, but I felt every stare like a physical weight. This was why I'd left. This judgment, this narrowness, this absolute certainty that there was only one right way to live a life. I found a seat toward the middle of the church, carefully choosing a pew where I wouldn't be completely alone but wouldn't have to make conversation. The sanctuary was beautiful in that traditional small-town way, stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes, polished oak pews, an altar draped in white cloth and adorned with elaborate floral arrangements that must have cost a fortune. Nothing was too good for Ethan's wedding. As I settled into my seat, I scanned the crowd looking for my parents. I spotted my mother near the front greeting guests with her practiced smile. My father stood beside her shaking hands and accepting congratulations, like he was the one getting married. Then I saw someone else. In the very back pew, almost hidden in the shadows, sat a woman I hadn't seen in more than a decade. Aunt Carol, my father's younger sister, looked older than I remembered. Her hair had gone completely grey, her face lined with years I knew nothing about. She sat alone, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Our eyes met across the crowded sanctuary, and something passed between us. An expression I couldn't quite read. Sadness, certainly, but also something that looked almost like regret, or maybe warning. Carol had been estranged from the family since I was in college, some kind of falling out with my father that no one ever explained to me. One day, she was at family dinners the next day. Her name became something we didn't mention. I'd asked my mother about it once, and she'd simply said, "Carol made her choices," in a tone that ended the conversation. Why was she here now? And why was she looking at me like that? Before I could process it, the organ music swelled. People began standing. The ceremony was about to start. I rose with everyone else turning toward the back of the church to watch the bridal party's entrance. That's when my father appeared beside me. I hadn't seen him approach. He slid into the pew like a shadow, his shoulder brushing against mine. The smell of his cologne, the same one he'd worn my entire life, brought back a flood of memories I didn't want. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence except to lean in close, his mouth inches from my ear. His voice was low enough that no one else could hear, but the words were crystal clear. "You'll give those keys tonight, Grace. Or you'll wish you had." My father moved away as smoothly as he'd appeared, leaving me standing there with his threat still ringing in my ears. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. I stood when I was supposed to stand, sat when others sat, but I couldn't tell you a single word the minister said. All I could think about was that whispered warning and the cold certainty in my father's voice. The reception was held in the church's fellowship hall, a large room that had been transformed with white linens, centerpieces of roses and hydrangeas, and string lights that gave everything a soft romantic glow. Someone had spent serious money on this wedding. The question was whose money? I found a seat at a table near the back, away from the family section, but not so far that my absence would be conspicuous. The other people at my table were distant relatives I barely recognised. A cousin I hadn't seen since childhood, her husband, an elderly great-uncle who spent most of the dinner complaining about his arthritis. They made polite conversation that I responded to automatically, while my attention remained fixed on my parents. My mother floated through the room like a queen, holding court, accepting compliments on the ceremony, the decorations, her dress. My father stayed close to Ethan and Melissa, one hand possessively on his son's shoulder, beaming with pride. Every so often, his eyes would find me across the room, and the smile would vanish, replaced by something harder. I was picking at my chicken when I heard the distinctive ping of silverware against crystal. Ethan stood at the head table, microphone in hand, waiting for the room to quiet. "Thank you all so much for being here," he began, his voice warm and confident. He'd always been good at public speaking and making people feel like they were part of something special. "Melissa and I are so grateful to have you here to celebrate with us." He went on about love and family and new beginnings, all the expected wedding toast platitudes. I started to relax slightly, thinking maybe the evening would pass without incident. Then Ethan turned and looked directly at me. "I'd like to invite my sister Grace to say a few words," he said, gesturing toward me with the microphone. "She came all the way from New York City for this. Grace, come on up. Give us a surprise speech for the bride." Every head in the room turned. I felt 200 pairs of eyes lock onto me. My heart hammered in my chest. This wasn't planned. We hadn't discussed this. But refusing would make a scene, would give them ammunition to paint me as the difficult sister who couldn't even give a simple toast at her brother's wedding. I stood on shaking legs and made my way to the front, taking the microphone from Ethan. His expression was unreadable, but he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. I looked out at the crowd of faces, some curious, some already judging, all waiting. I took a breath and found my professional voice, the one I used for client presentations, when I needed to project confidence I didn't feel. "Thank you, Ethan," I began. "I have to admit, this is a surprise, but it's a beautiful one." I turned to Melissa, who sat watching me with a smile that seemed painted on. "Melissa, welcome to the family. I hope you and Ethan build a wonderful life together filled with love, understanding, and all the happiness you both deserve." I meant it, or at least I wanted to mean it. To family. I raised an imaginary glass, and to new beginnings. The room applauded politely. I handed the microphone back to Ethan, relief flooding through me. I'd made it through without incident, but I'd barely taken a step back toward my table when my mother stood up. She moved with purpose, intercepting me before I could escape taking the microphone from Ethan's hand. The room, which had started to return to conversation and dinner, quieted again. "Since we're sharing speeches, my mother said, her voice bright but with an edge I recognised, "I'd like to say something about my daughter Grace." She looked at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, never reached her eyes when she looked at me. "My daughter has always been better at buying things than loving people. She has a beautiful apartment in the city, but no one to share it with. She's built a successful career, but she's never built a family." The room had gone completely silent. I felt my face burning, my hands beginning to tremble. "But maybe tonight," my mother continued, her voice taking on a strange, almost rehearsed quality, "she'll finally learn what family really means, what it means to contribute to something bigger than yourself, to put family before personal ambition." A few people laughed nervously. Someone in the back coughed. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to respond. The humiliation washed over me in waves, but underneath it was something else. A growing realization that this wasn't just a cruel comment. This was part of something planned. I forced myself to smile, to nod, as if she'd said something touching rather than devastating, and somehow made it back to my table. My legs felt like water. The elderly great-uncle patted my hand awkwardly and said something about mothers being mothers, but I barely heard him. That's when I noticed my father. He stood near the bar, deep in conversation with a man I didn't recognize. The man was in his 60s, wearing an expensive suit that stood out even in this dressed-up crowd. Everything about him said attorney, from his leather portfolio to the way he stood with practiced authority. My father was speaking to him in low, urgent tones, and they kept glancing in my direction. The attorney would nod, check something in his portfolio, nod again. I followed their gazes and realized they weren't the only ones watching me. Melissa, still seated at the head table, had her eyes fixed on me with an expression that made my skin crawl. It wasn't hostility exactly, it was satisfaction, like she was watching a plan unfold exactly as expected. And Ethan, my brother, who just invited me to make a toast, sat staring at his plate, his jaw tight, refusing to look at me at all. The trap my mother had mentioned on the phone, the one I'd felt closing around me since I arrived, suddenly felt suffocatingly real. They'd planned this. All of it. The toast, my mother's speech, whatever was coming next. My phone vibrated in my clutch. I pulled it out, grateful for any distraction. From the stairs I could still feel following me. Unknown number. A text message that made my blood run cold. "They're planning something. Get out while you still can." I stared at the message, reading it 3 times, as if the words might change. Get out while you still can. My thumb hovered over the screen, ready to text back and ask who this was when I heard the ping of silverware on crystal again. My father stood at the front of the room, microphone in hand, that broad smile he reserved for public moments plastered across his face. My stomach dropped. "If I could have everyone's attention for just one more moment," he announced, his voice booming with authority. The room quieted immediately. People turned in their chairs, some still holding forks halfway to their mouths. I know we've had some beautiful toasts tonight, but there's one more tradition I'd like to honour. A Miller family tradition. I'd never heard of any Miller family tradition. My hands gripped the edge of the table. Grace, my father continued, turning to look directly at me. As the older sister, as the one who's achieved such success in the city, we'd like you to participate in something special. A symbol of passing that success to the next generation. He gestured grandly toward Ethan and Melissa. We'd like you to give your loft keys to Ethan and Melissa as a wedding gift. A place for them to start their new life together in New York. For a moment, I couldn't process what I'd heard. The words didn't make sense like he'd spoken in a foreign language. Then the room erupted in applause. People were clapping, smiling, nodding at each other like this was the most beautiful, generous gesture they'd ever witnessed. An older woman at the next table actually had tears in her eyes. I sat completely frozen, my mind racing. He couldn't be serious. He couldn't actually expect me to hand over my home, my life's work, my entire existence in front of 200 people like it was a set of car keys. But the applause continued and my father stood there waiting, his smile fixed, his eyes locked on mine with an expression that wasn't fatherly at all. It was expectation, demand, warning. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me. Every eye in the room tracked my movement. The applause died down to expectant silence. Dad, I think there's been some misunderstanding. My voice came out shakier than I wanted, but at least it came out. That loft is my home. I've lived there for 20 years. I built my entire career there. It's not something I can just give away. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched confusion ripple through the crowd, then whispers starting up like a swarm of insects. My father's smile didn't waver, but something cold and hard crystallized in his eyes. Grace, he said, his voice still measured, still public-friendly, but with steel underneath. You seem to have forgotten something important. I co-signed that loan when you were 28 years old. No bank would have given you that property without my help, without my name, my reputation, my financial backing. That property has always belonged to this family. The whispers grew louder. I felt the room's opinion shifting, turning the earlier judgment about my lifestyle choices, now mixing with something else. Ingratitude, selfishness. I paid for that loft, I said, my voice stronger, now fueled by rising anger. Every mortgage payment for 20 years, every renovation, every property tax bill, that's my home, not yours. Before my father could respond, my mother stood up. I'd been so focused on him that I hadn't seen her moving closer, positioning herself. Now she stood just a few feet away from me, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the entire room. We raised you, Grace. Her voice was rising, each word louder than the last. We paid for your education. We fed you, clothed, you gave you everything you needed to succeed. And now when your brother is starting a family, when he needs help, you can't find it in your heart to give back. Mum, that's not fair. Ethan is starting a family. She was nearly shouting now, her face flushed. He's doing what you never could, what you never even tried to do. He needs that space. He needs a place to build a life, to raise children. What do you need it for? You're alone anyway. You're 48 years old, living by yourself in a city full of strangers. You'll always be alone, Grace. That's who you are. That's who you've always been. Each word landed like a physical blow. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, my face hot with shame and rage, and something I couldn't even name. The room had gone completely silent now, 200 people watching this public dissection of my life, my choices, my worth as a human being. Some people looked away uncomfortably. Others stared with undisguised curiosity like I was a car accident they couldn't help but watch. A few nodded in agreement with my mother's assessment. That loft represents our investment in you." My father added, his voice quieter now, but somehow more threatening. "An investment that hasn't paid the returns we expected. It's time for that property to serve the family the way it was meant to." I looked to Ethan, desperate for any sign that he might intervene, might tell them this was insane, but my brother sat at the head table staring at his hands, his jaw clenched tight. Melissa sat beside him, watching me with that same cold satisfaction. "I'm not giving you my home," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice suddenly sounded. "I don't care what you co-signed 20 years ago. That's my property, my life, and you can't have it." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Then my mother started walking toward me slowly, deliberately, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. When she spoke, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of the room, everyone heard every word. "Then let's take back what's ours, Grace, starting tonight." I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and walk out of that room. But I stood frozen, watching my mother close the distance between us, unable to believe this was really happening. Then I felt hands on my arms. 2 men grabbed me from behind their grip, iron tight on my biceps. I recognized them, cousins from my father's side men I'd seen maybe twice in my adult life. They wrenched my arms backward, holding me in place. "What are you doing?" I screamed, trying to pull away. "Let me go." But they didn't let go. Their hands only tightened, and when I struggled, one of them twisted my arm hard enough that I gasped in pain. Around the room I heard shocked murmurs, chairs scraping as people half stood, uncertain what was happening. My mother reached into her purse. For a surreal moment, I thought she might pull out papers, documents I'd need to sign. Instead, she withdrew something small and black. It took me a second to recognize what it was. An electric hair clipper. She'd brought it with her, planned this, came to her son's wedding prepared to do this. "Mum," I heard myself say, and my voice sounded strange, distant. "What are you doing?" Her face was completely expressionless, cold in a way I'd never seen before, not even in the worst moments of my childhood. She held up the clipper so I could see it clearly. "If you won't give us the keys willingly," she said, her voice carrying across the stunned silence of the room, "then you'll learn humility another way. Maybe this will teach you that pride comes before a fall." "You can't," I started, but the words died as she switched on the clipper. The buzzing sound filled the room like a swarm of angry hornets. Several people gasped. I saw movement in my peripheral vision, guests standing, backing away a few, heading toward the exits. Others pulled out their phones, raising them to record what was happening. "Dad's clients are watching," I screamed, looking desperately toward my father. "Your business partners, stop this." But my father stood motionless, his arms crossed, watching, and my mother raised the clipper to my head. I fought, I thrashed and twisted and tried to pull away, but the cousins holding me were strong, and when I struggled too hard, one of them grabbed a fistful of my hair and yanked my head back, holding me still. Pain shot through my scalp. The clipper touched my forehead, and I felt the first pass tear through my hair. A chunk of it fell past my face, landing on the floor at my feet. Dark strands on the polished hardwood. "Please," I whispered, all the fight suddenly draining out of me. "Please, don't do this." My mother didn't respond, didn't even look at my face. She just made another pass with the clipper, and another, and another. I could hear sounds around me, gasps, whispers, someone crying. I heard Melissa's high-pitched giggle quickly stifled. I saw Ethan finally stand up from the head table, his face white as paper, but he didn't move toward us. He just stood there, paralyzed, watching his mother shave his sister's head in the middle of his wedding reception. In the back of the room, I caught sight of Aunt Carol. She'd half risen from her seat, one hand reaching out as if to intervene. Our eyes met across the crowd, and I saw horror in her expression, and something else, recognition maybe. Like she'd seen this kind of cruelty from my father's family before. But then My father moved. He walked calmly to the back of the room and leaned down, whispering something in Carol's ear. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw the effect. Carol's face crumpled. She sank back into her seat, tears streaming down her face, her hands covering her mouth. Whatever he'd said, it had been enough to stop her. The clipper kept buzzing. More hair fell. I stopped fighting and just stood there, held upright by the cousins gripping my arms, while my mother systematically removed every strand of hair from my head. My scalp felt cold and exposed. Mascara ran down my cheeks in black streams. I could taste salt from my tears mixing with the humiliation burning in my throat. Finally, mercifully, the buzzing stopped. The cousins released my arms. I stumbled slightly, catching myself. Around me, the floor was covered in dark hair. My hair. 20 years of growth gone in 5 minutes. I raised a shaking hand to my head and felt only smooth, bare skin. The room was completely silent. 200 people staring at me. Some looked horrified, some looked away, ashamed to have witnessed this. A few too many looked satisfied, like I'd gotten what I deserved for refusing to know my place. I felt something crack inside me then. Not break crack, like ice fracturing, but not yet giving way. I reached up and carefully wiped the tears from my face, smearing the mascara but clearing my vision. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back, and I looked directly at my mother. A smile curved across my face. Not a happy smile. Something cold and controlled and absolutely certain. "Thank you, Mum," I said clearly, my voice steady now, projecting across the silent room. "You just made this official." I didn't wait for her response. I turned and walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. People scrambled out of my way, pressing back against tables and chairs to avoid me. As I reached the door, I looked back one last time at my parents, at my brother, at all the people who'd watched this happen without intervening. My voice rang out clear and final. "See you in court." I was 3 steps from the exit when the doors exploded inward. A man strode into the reception hall with the kind of purposeful energy that made everyone stop and turn. He was in his early 50s, wearing a charcoal suit that looked expensive even to my designer's eye, and he carried himself with absolute authority. I'd never seen him before in my life, but something about his timing, his confidence made my heart leap with a hope I didn't understand yet. He stopped in the centre of the room, surveying the scene, the hair scattered across the floor, me standing bald and tear-stained, my mother still holding the clippers, the guests frozen in various states of shock and horror. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "My name is Mark Jensen and I'm an attorney. Everything that just happened here has been recorded." He held up his phone, and I could see the red recording indicator still blinking. "Ms. Grace Miller has documented evidence of assault, public humiliation, and attempted coercion. This recording is now in the custody of law enforcement." The room erupted. My father lurched forward, his face turning purple. "Who the hell are you? You can't just, I can and I have." Mark cut him off smoothly. "Ms. Miller has been recording since she arrived. The entire conversation about demanding her property, the public humiliation and the physical assault, all of it captured on video with audio." He turned slowly, making eye contact with people throughout the room, along with the faces of everyone who witnessed it and did nothing. That's when the real panic started. Guests began moving toward the exits in a rush, some practically running. People who'd been recording on their phones quickly put them away, as if that could undo their participation. I heard fragments of desperate conversation. "I didn't know they were going to do that," and "we should leave," and "I can't be associated with this." My mother dropped the clippers, the sound of them hitting the floor obscenely loud in the chaos. "This is absurd. She's our daughter. We were just what?" Mark's voice cut through like a blade. "Physically restraining her against her will. That's assault and battery. Forcibly cutting her hair in public to coerce her into signing over property. That's assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress and attempted extortion. He looked at my father. And I'm particularly interested in those loan documents you had her signed 20 years ago, Mr. Miller. The ones you claimed gave you co-ownership rights. My father's face went from purple to white in an instant. Ethan suddenly stood up from the head table, turning to Melissa with an expression of dawning horror. Did you know about this? Did you know they were going to do this to her? Melissa's composed mask cracked. Tears started streaming down her carefully made-up face. Your parents said it was just to scare her into signing. They said she'd been selfish her whole life and just needed to be pushed a little. They didn't say anything about... She gestured helplessly at the hair on the floor at me. I didn't know it would be like this. You knew enough, Ethan said quietly, and something in his voice made me look at him. My brother's face had gone grey. He looked at me across the room, and for the first time in years I saw something other than indifference in his eyes. Guilt, horror, maybe even shame. But it was too late for that now. Mark walked over to where I stood near the door. Ms. Miller, are you ready to leave? I nodded, not trusting my voice. My hands had started shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, and I clasped them together to hide it. Mark placed a protective hand on my shoulder, steering me toward the exit. Behind us, I could hear my mother starting to cry, my father shouting something about lawyers, the wedding guests still fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. We walked out into the cool evening air. The parking lot was nearly empty. Most people had apparently decided to leave through the side exits rather than face us. Mark led me to a dark sedan parked near the entrance. I got into the passenger seat, and only then, with the door closed and the reception hall behind us, did I allow myself to fall apart. My hands shook violently. I touched my bare head again, still unable to fully process what had happened, what had been done to me. Mark got in the driver's seat and started the engine, but he didn't pull out of the parking lot immediately. Instead, he looked at me with something that might have been respect. You did it, he said quietly. You actually went through with the plan. I had pulled out my phone with trembling hands and opened a group chat I'd created 3 months ago. 3 contacts, all with initials instead of names. I typed quickly, phase 1 complete, evidence secured. The responses came immediately. Good work. Uploading back up to cloud now. Standing by for phase 2. Mark put the car in gear and pulled onto the dark country road that would take us back towards civilization. My head felt cold where my hair used to be. My face was a mess of dried tears and smeared makeup. Every part of me hurt physically, emotionally, in ways I couldn't even name yet. But underneath the pain, underneath the shock and humiliation, something else was growing. Something hard and cold and absolutely certain. My phone buzzed with a new message. I looked down and saw it was from Mark's number, even though he was sitting right next to me. I glanced at him confused. He kept his eyes on the road, but allowed himself a small grim smile. Check it. I opened the message. It read, they're already calling their lawyers, but we have something they don't, the truth. I stared at the message for a long moment, then looked at my reflection in the side mirror. A bald woman with mascara-streaked cheeks and eyes that looked nothing like the Grace Miller who'd driven here this morning. That Grace had been afraid, had hoped, despite everything, that her family might surprise her with basic human decency. This Grace knew better. This Grace was ready for war. Mark's law office was in Midtown on the 23rd floor of a building with views of the East River. I arrived Sunday morning wearing dark sunglasses and a silk scarf wrapped around my head, feeling like I was in disguise in my own life. The receptionist area was empty on the weekend, but Mark was waiting for me 2 cups of coffee already steaming on his desk. He gestured to a leather chair across from him. I sat carefully, like my body might break if I moved too quickly. Everything hurt. My scalp was tender where my mother had been rougher with the clippers. My arms ached where my cousins had held me. But the worst pain was somewhere deeper, somewhere I couldn't locate or name. How are you holding up? Mark asked, his voice gentle. I almost laughed. I'm bored and traumatized. How do you think I'm holding up? He nodded, accepting that. I know this isn't easy, but I need you to understand something, Grace. What happened last night, as horrible as it was, gives us everything we need to destroy them. I took off my sunglasses, meeting his eyes. Then help me understand. Start from the beginning. Who are you really, Mark? Why did you agree to help me? He leaned back in his chair, and for a moment something painful crossed his face. 3 months ago, you contacted me through my firm's website. You said you had suspicions about your parents and your property, and you needed someone who understood business fraud. He paused, his jaw tightening. What you didn't know was that I already knew your father. Quite well, actually. My stomach tightened. How? 10 years ago, my family owned Jensen Supplies. We were your father's main competitor in the region. We had a good business, loyal customers, solid reputation. Then, your father started a campaign to destroy us. Mark's voice remained even, but I could hear the anger underneath. He used every legal loophole he could find, undercut our prices to the point where we couldn't compete, poached our employees, spread rumours through the business community that we were having financial troubles, that we used inferior products. None of it was true, but the damage was done. I had no idea, I said quietly. Why would you? You'd already left. But my father knew. He tried to fight back, tried to clear our name, but your father had too many connections, too much influence in that town. Within 2 years, we'd lost everything. Had to close the business, sell the building. My father had a massive heart attack 6 months later. The doctors said it was stress-related. Mark's eyes met mine. He died, knowing that Raymond Miller had destroyed everything he'd built. The guilt hit me like a wave, even though I knew intellectually that none of this was my fault. I'm so sorry. When you reached out to me when I saw your name, I almost didn't take the case. But then I read your message, and I realized you were trying to fight the same man who'd destroyed my family. I saw a chance to help you and maybe find some closure for what happened to my father. I understood then. This wasn't just about my loft. This was about justice that was a decade overdue. So, what did you find? I asked. Mark pulled out a thick folder and opened it between us. 20 years ago, when your father helped you get that loan, he didn't just co-sign. Hidden in that stack of documents you signed was something called a quit-claim deed. Do you know what that is? I shook my head, It's a legal document that transfers property ownership. You unknowingly signed away 50% ownership of your loft to your father. The words hit me like a physical blow. That's not possible. I would have known. Would you have? You were 28, excited, trusting your father, and he gave you a stack of maybe 30 documents to sign. Mortgage papers, insurance forms, bank authorizations. The quit-claim deed was buried in the middle, and he titled it something innocuous like property authorization form. You signed it, and suddenly, your father owned half your home. I felt sick. For 20 years. But it gets worse. Mark pulled out more documents, spreading them across the desk. Over the past 15 years, your father has been taking out loans using your loft as collateral. He's been forging power of attorney documents with your signature. I've had a forensic document analyst confirm the forgeries. He'd take these fake documents to different banks, use his 50% ownership as leverage and secure loans. Small ones at first, then bigger ones. Total debt secured against your property, $1.2 million. The room spun slightly. 1.2 million. If you'd signed over those keys last night, if you'd transferred full ownership to Ethan and Melissa, it would have legitimized all of your father's fraud. The banks could have foreclosed on the property to recover their money, and legally there would have been nothing you could do about it. Your father would have walked away clean, and you'd have lost everything. I sat back in my chair trying to process this. My father hadn't just betrayed me. He'd been systematically defrauding banks using my property for 15 years. And last night's humiliation was supposed to be the final piece of his scheme. "The recording," I said, remembering. "Tell me about the recording." Mark's expression shifted to something that might have been admiration. "That was all you. You came to me 3 months ago with a plan. You said you knew they'd go too far if they felt cornered, that your parents couldn't help but reveal their true nature if they thought they were winning. You bought that spy camera yourself, disguised as a button on your jacket, military-grade equipment." I touched my chest, remembering the small weight I'd felt all evening. I wore it the entire time. I was parked in the lot with my laptop monitoring the feed remotely. Everything was captured: the conversation about the keys, your mother's speech, your father's threats, and then the assault itself. When you said, "Thank you, Mum, you just made this official," I knew that was my signal. You'd gotten everything we needed. "Premeditated assault," I said, slowly understanding. "They planned to humiliate me into signing. The clippers weren't a spontaneous act of rage. My mother brought them with her." "Exactly, which makes it assault with intent, public humiliation, with the purpose of coercion and attempted extortion. Combined with the financial fraud, we have both criminal and civil cases that will destroy them." For the first time since the wedding, I felt something other than pain and shock. I felt power, control, the satisfaction of knowing that I hadn't been a victim, I'd been setting a trap. Mark reached for his laptop and turned it toward me, his expression darkening. "But Grace, there's more. I've been digging deeper into your father's financial records, and I found something that changes everything." He clicked open a file, and I leaned forward to look at the screen. "This isn't just about your loft anymore. Look at these." I woke up Monday morning to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Before I could even process what that meant, my phone rang again. It was my business partner, Diana. "Grace, have you seen the news?" Her voice was tight with concern. "What news? Turn on Channel 6. Now." I grabbed the remote with shaking hands and switched on the television. The local morning news was on, and there, sitting in the studio with tears streaming down her face, was my mother. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Mother speaks out after daughter's wedding day attack." My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her voice breaking as she spoke to the sympathetic host. "My daughter Grace has always been troubled. We've tried for years to help her, to bring her back into the family, but she's pushed us away her whole life. What happened at the wedding? I was just trying to calm her down when she became violent." "That's a lie," I whispered to my empty loft. The host leaned forward. "This must be so difficult for you." "It is." My mother's voice trembled. "As a mother, you never stop loving your child, no matter what they do. We just want Grace to get the help she needs." Then my father appeared on screen, his arm around my mother's shoulders. He looked tired, haggard, like a man who'd been through hell. "We're heartbroken," he said. "All we've ever wanted was for our daughter to be happy. But somewhere along the way, she became so consumed with material success that she lost sight of what really matters. Family, love, connection." I turned off the television before I threw the remote through it. My phone rang again. "Diana," I answered. "Grace, the board is meeting in an hour. They're getting calls from clients. I'm trying to hold them off, but what? They want to put you on temporary leave, pending investigation." The words hit me like a slap. "Investigation of what I'm the victim here." "I know that. I believe you, but the optics are bad, Grace. Your mother is on TV crying, your father looks devastated, and there's already a hashtag trending about family loyalty. The board is worried about the firm's reputation." Within 48 hours, everything I built started crumbling. The design firm officially placed me on leave with a carefully worded statement about taking time to address personal matters. 3 of my biggest clients called to cancel their contracts, citing reputational concerns and moral clauses in our agreements. My assistant stopped answering my emails. On social media, the story exploded. The video of what happened at the wedding had leaked somehow, but it had been edited. The parts showing my father's threat, my mother's premeditation, the cousins holding me down, all of that was gone. What remained was a short clip of me refusing to give the keys, followed by a chaotic scene that could be interpreted any way you wanted. The comments were vicious. Entitled city woman thinks she's too good for her own family. She attacked her own mother at her brother's wedding. This is what happens when women prioritize career over family. Some people defended me, tried to point out the missing context, but they were drowned out by the mob. I started receiving hate mail. Actual letters sent to my loft filled with ugly words about what kind of person I was, what I deserved. Someone spray-painted "family killer" on the building's entrance before the super could clean it off. My phone number was leaked online, and the death threats started rolling in. Old colleagues I'd known for years stopped returning my calls. People I considered friends suddenly couldn't meet for coffee, couldn't talk, were too busy to engage with what they clearly saw as radioactive drama. I tried to stay strong, reminded myself that Mark and I had evidence that the truth would come out. But it was like trying to hold back a flood with my bare hands. Then, on Wednesday evening, I made the mistake of turning on the television again. Ethan was being interviewed on the same local news show. My little brother, who'd stood paralysed while our mother shaved my head, was now sitting in that same studio chair crying. "My sister has always been jealous of me," he said, his voice breaking. Growing up, she resented that our parents supported my dreams while she felt overlooked. But the truth is, Grace pushed everyone away. She's been planning something like this for years. She can't stand to see me happy, can't stand that I'm starting a family while she's alone. The host made sympathetic noises. "That must be so painful for you." "It is. She's my sister. I love her. But what she did at my wedding, trying to ruin the happiest day of my life because I'm getting what she never could." He wiped his eyes. "I just hope she finds peace someday." Something inside me shattered. Not my parents' betrayal, I'd expected that, prepared for that. But Ethan, my brother, the person I'd protected from our parents' worst impulses when we were kids, who I'd helped with homework and defended when other kids picked on him. He was looking into a camera and telling the world that I was the monster. I sat alone in my loft that night, the edited video playing on loop on my laptop, reading comment after comment about what a terrible person I was. My hand found the scissors I kept in my kitchen drawer. I went to the bathroom and stared at my reflection. The stubble was starting to grow back on my scalp, tiny patches of hair that reminded me of what had been taken. I opened the scissors. My phone rang, Mark's name flashing on the screen. I almost didn't answer. "Grace," he said the moment I picked up, "I need you to put down whatever you're thinking of doing and listen to me." "How did you..." "Because I know what it looks like when someone is about to give up. Don't do anything. I just found something. Your mother's diary from 20 years ago. Grace, you need to see this before the world does." I set down the scissors, my hand shaking. "What kind of diary?" "The kind that proves everything. Meet me at my office in an hour, and Grace, bring your wig. We're about to change the narrative." I hung up and looked at myself in the mirror one more time. Bald, exhausted, publicly destroyed, but still standing. My phone buzzed with a new email. I opened it just without thinking, expecting another hate message. Instead, it was from an address I didn't recognise. The subject line read "National Talk Show Opportunity." I clicked it open. The message was from a producer at one of the biggest daytime talk shows in America. "Ms. Miller, we've been following your story. We'd like to give you a platform to share your side. Our audience is 10 million viewers. Bring the receipts. America loves a comeback story." I read it 3 times, then forwarded it to Mark. His response came immediately. "Accept it. By the time we're done, they won't know what hit them." The studio was colder than I expected, or maybe that was just my nerves. I sat in the guest chair while a makeup artist tried to make me look presentable under the bright lights, carefully applying foundation to my face while avoiding my bare scalp. I'd made the decision a week ago not to wear a wig, let them see what was done to me. Mark stood off to the side just out of camera range, giving me an encouraging nod. We'd spent 7 days preparing for this moment, reviewing every document, planning every answer, anticipating every question the host might ask. This was our chance to change the narrative, and we couldn't afford to get it wrong. The host, Rebecca Chen, was known for tough interviews and not letting guests off easy. She'd built her career on getting to the truth, which was exactly why Mark had convinced me to choose her show over others that had offered softer approaches. 2 minutes, someone called out. Rebecca took her seat across from me, and when our eyes met, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not pity, curiosity maybe, and determination to get to the bottom of the story. 60 seconds. My heart pounded so hard I thought the microphone clipped to my jacket might pick it up. And we're live in 5, 4, 3. The countdown ended with pointed fingers, and suddenly I was looking at 10 million people through the camera lens. Rebecca's introduction was straightforward. She outlined the basic facts, the wedding, the viral video, my family's version of events, and then she turned to me. Grace, let me start with the question everyone wants to know. Why did you record your own humiliation? I'd practiced this answer 100 times, but sitting there under those lights with my bald head visible to millions of strangers, the rehearsed words disappeared. What came out was simpler and more honest. Because truth needs witnesses, I said. I knew that if my parents felt cornered, if they thought they were winning, they would reveal who they truly are. They wouldn't be able to help themselves. I just needed the world to see it too. You're saying this was planned, that you anticipated they would assault you. I knew they were capable of cruelty. I'd experienced it my whole life, but I didn't know it would go this far. I hoped it wouldn't. I took a breath. I was wrong. Rebecca leaned forward. Show us what the world hasn't seen yet. Mark had uploaded everything to the show's production team earlier. Now, on the monitors around the studio and on screens in homes across America, the full video began to play. Not the edited version my parents' PR firm had leaked. The complete recording from the moment I arrived at the church to the moment I walked out of the reception hall. The audience watched my father's whispered threat during the ceremony, my mother's toxic speech, the demand for my keys framed as a family tradition, my refusal. And then the assault, my cousins grabbing my arms, holding me in place, while I screamed for them to stop my mother pulling out the clippers she'd brought with her, the systematic removal of my hair, while guests recorded and others fled. The studio audience sat in absolute silence. I watched a woman in the front row cover her mouth with her hand. Others looked away, unable to watch. But the cameras kept rolling, and the video kept playing, including the sound of Melissa's giggle, and my mother's steady breathing as she worked, showing that this wasn't rage or passion, it was deliberate, calculated humiliation. When the video ended, Rebecca had to clear her throat before speaking. And your family is claiming you attacked them. They are, because the edited version they released doesn't show the planning, the premeditation, or the fact that I was physically restrained by 2 adult men while this was done to me. But there's more to this story than assault, isn't there? This was the moment we'd been building toward. I nodded to Mark, who brought out the documents we'd prepared. 20 years ago, I said, my voice steady now. My father helped me secure a loan to buy my loft in New York. I was grateful. I thought it was one of the few times he'd actually supported me. What I didn't know was that hidden in the documents he had me sign was a quit-claim deed transferring 50% ownership to him. I watched Rebecca's expression shift from sympathy to shock as I laid out the evidence. The forged power of attorney documents. The loans my father had taken out using my property as collateral loans I knew nothing about. Bank records showing $1.2 million in debt secured against my home. They needed me to sign over the loft, I explained, to legitimize 15 years of fraud. When I refused, they decided to break me publicly, so I'd be desperate enough to give them what they wanted. The studio was so quiet I could hear the cameras moving on their tracks. Rebecca looked at me with something like awe. How long have you known about the fraud? 3 months. That's when I hired Mark Jensen to investigate. That's when we started preparing for what happened at the wedding. You walked into that wedding knowing they would try to destroy you. I walked in knowing that the only way to stop them was to let them show the world who they really are. And I was right. Rebecca turned to the camera. We reached out to Grace's parents for comment. They declined to appear on this show. She looked back at me. What do you want people to know, Grace? I met the camera's eye, speaking directly to everyone watching. This isn't revenge. This is justice. And we're just getting started. The collapse happened faster than I'd expected. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, Miller Hardware and Supply lost its largest contracts. By the end of the first week, employees were resigning en masse, not wanting their names associated with fraud and abuse. By the end of the second week, my father had filed for bankruptcy and closed the business permanently. 35 years of work gone. My mother was asked to resign from the women's club at church, then from the hospital auxiliary board, then from every social organisation she'd spent decades building her reputation through. The town that had once celebrated the Miller family now crossed the street to avoid them. Ethan called me once. I didn't answer, but he left a voicemail that I listened to 3 times before deleting. His voice was hollow, defeated. Grace, I'm so sorry. I didn't know about the fraud. I swear I didn't know, but that doesn't excuse what I said. I destroyed you on television because Dad told me. It doesn't matter what he told me. I should have stood up for you. I'm sorry. A long pause. Melissa left me. Filed for divorce yesterday. Said she married into a family, not a scandal. And my company let me go this morning. They said they can't have someone associated with this kind of publicity on staff. Another pause. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I sat with that voicemail for an hour before finally deleting it. Sorry wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Mark called with updates almost daily. The house in Pennsylvania was going into foreclosure. My parents had taken out a second mortgage to pay for lawyers. The FBI had opened a formal investigation into the bank fraud. Everything was proceeding exactly as we'd planned. But somehow, I felt empty, hollow, like I'd won a battle but lost something I couldn't name. I was working late at my loft on a Thursday evening trying to focus on a design proposal when the building's doorman called up. Miss Miller, there's someone in the lobby asking to see you. She says she's your mother. My hand tightened on the phone. Tell her to leave. I tried. Ma'am, she's on her knees. She's crying and people are staring. Should I call the police? I closed my eyes. I'll come down. She looked nothing like the composed woman who'd shaved my head 2 weeks ago. My mother's hair was unwashed, pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore sweatpants and an old jacket. No makeup. Her face was red and swollen from crying. When she saw me step out of the elevator, she actually got on her knees in the middle of my building's marble lobby. Please, Grace, she sobbed. Please forgive us. We were desperate. We made terrible choices, but we're still your parents. Doesn't that mean anything? I looked down at her, this woman who'd given birth to me, and then they spent 48 years making me feel like I wasn't enough. I felt nothing. No satisfaction in seeing her broken. No pity. Nothing. You weren't desperate when you held me down, I said quietly. You were laughing. I wasn't. I have the video, Mum. The full, unedited version. I can hear you laughing. Her face crumpled. Security had already called up another guard, and together they helped my mother to her feet and escorted her out. She kept looking back at me, reaching out, but I'd already turned toward the elevator. Back in my loft, I tried to return to work, but couldn't focus. Something felt incomplete. Wrong. Like there was a piece of this story I was missing. The knock on my door came at 8 o'clock. Through the peephole, I saw Aunt Carol. I hadn't spoken to her since the wedding, hadn't even known how to reach her. But here she was, standing in my hallway clutching something against her chest. I opened the door. "Grace," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to tell you something I should have told you 35 years ago." I let her in. She sat on my couch, still holding what I now saw was an old photo album. Her hand shook as she opened it. "When you were 3 years old," she began, "I had a daughter, Emma. She was 5. Carol's finger traced a photo of a little girl with dark curls and a gap-toothed smile. "Your father was driving drunk one night. He ran a red light and hit another car. Emma was in that car with me. She died at the scene. The air left my lungs." "What?" "Your father used his connections, his money to cover it up. He pinned the blame on the other driver, a young man who couldn't afford a good lawyer. That man went to prison for vehicular manslaughter while your father walked free." Tears streamed down Carol's face. "He came to me at Emma's funeral and said, 'If you ever speak about what really happened, I'll destroy you too. I'll make sure everyone thinks you're a crazy, grieving mother who can't accept that accidents happen.' I was terrified, broken, so I stayed silent. I couldn't speak, couldn't process what I was hearing. At the wedding," Carol continued, "I tried to stop them from hurting you. I stood up. But your father came over and whispered in my ear, 'Remember, Emma. Remember what happens when you cross me. Stay quiet, or I'll make sure something worse happens to Grace.'" She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I was a coward. I let him control me for 35 years. But Grace, I was also the one who sent you that warning text. I couldn't save my daughter, but maybe I could help save you." My mind was reeling. My father hadn't just committed fraud. He'd killed a child and destroyed a man's life to cover it up. Carol reached into her bag and pulled out a small recording device. "But 3 months ago, I stopped being a coward. When your father and mother were planning what to do at the wedding, I hid this in their living room. I recorded everything they said." She pressed play. My father's voice crackled through the tiny speaker, and I felt my whole body go cold. "The banks are closing in Margaret. We have maybe 3 months before they discover the discrepancies in the loan documents. Can't we just sell the house, use that money to pay them back?" My mother's voice thin and desperate. "The house won't cover half of what we owe. We need Grace's loft. It's worth enough to clear everything and still leave us with a cushion. She'll never agree to sign it over. You know that." A long pause, then my father's voice again colder now. "Then we make her agree. At the wedding, in front of everyone, we back her into a corner where saying no makes her look like the villain. Raymond, she's our daughter. She's a selfish woman who's lived off our generosity for 20 years. She owes us, and if she won't pay up willingly, we'll take it." I heard my mother crying softly on the recording. "I can't do this to her." "Then we both go to prison, Margaret." My father's voice was ice. "You signed those loan applications too. You co-signed the power of attorney forms. You're as guilty as I am in the eyes of the law. We either get Grace to transfer that property or we lose everything, and Ethan's future is destroyed along with ours." The silence stretched so long I thought the recording had ended. Then my mother's voice, barely a whisper. "What do you need me to do?" Carol stopped the recording. We sat in silence, the weight of what I'd just heard pressing down on me like a physical force. "There's more," Carol said quietly. 2 hours of them planning every detail, how they'd phrase the demand to make you look unreasonable, how they'd use Ethan and Melissa as props, and when you refused... She swallowed hard. "Your mother didn't want to do it. She begged him to find another way. But he told her that public humiliation was the only thing that would break you enough to sign." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights blurring through my tears. My mother wasn't the monster I'd made her into. She was something more complicated, more tragic. A woman who'd spent her entire marriage trapped by a man who threatened to destroy everything if she didn't comply. But she'd still chosen Ethan over me. Every single time. "I'm giving this to your lawyer," Carol said. "All of it, every recording. It proves premeditation conspiracy and shows your father's pattern of threatening family members to get what he wants." I turned back to her. "Why now? Why did you wait 35 years? "Because I was afraid. Because I was weak. Because he killed my daughter and I let him get away with it." Her voice broke. "But when I heard him planning to hurt you the same way he'd hurt me using threats, manipulation, destroying you to save himself, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I couldn't let him take another daughter." After Carol left, I called Mark. It was nearly midnight, but he answered on the first ring. "I have new evidence," I said. "Recordings of them planning everything. And Mark, there's something else. Something about my father from 35 years ago." The next morning, Mark called me to his office. He'd spent the night analysing the recordings and cross-referencing the financial documents with Carol's testimony. "Grace," he said, his face grave, "this changes everything. With the recordings proving premeditation and conspiracy combined with the forged signatures, I can prove with forensic analysis your father is looking at 20 to 25 years in federal prison. Your mother, as an accessory and co-conspirator, could face 8 to 10 years. I nodded, feeling numb. "But there's something else." He pulled up documents on his screen. "I found loan applications your mother signed. She wasn't just a victim in this, she actively participated in the fraud, even if she was coerced into it. The law doesn't care about her motivations, only her actions." That afternoon, as I was sitting in my loft trying to process everything, there was another knock at my door. Ethan stood in the hallway holding a cardboard box. His eyes were red, his face unshaven. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. "I found these in Mom and Dad's attic," he said. "I think you should read them." Inside were leather-bound journals, my mother's handwriting filling page after page. I opened one at random. "I see how he treats Grace differently. I know it's wrong, but if I protect her, he threatens to leave us with nothing. Ethan needs his father. I have to stay silent." I flipped to another entry years later. "Grace got into Harvard. Full scholarship. She was so proud. But Raymond refused to pay for housing or expenses. He said she didn't need an education, she needed a husband." I said nothing. I hate myself for saying nothing. Page after page, year after year, my mother documenting every injustice, every cruelty, every choice she made to sacrifice me for Ethan, and hating herself for it. Ethan was crying now, openly sobbing. "Mom sacrificed you to protect me my whole life, and I never questioned it. I never asked why I got everything while you got nothing. I just accepted it as my due." He looked at me with devastated eyes. "I'll testify, Grace. I'll tell them everything. I'll help you any way I can." I looked at my brother, then at the diaries, then back at him. When I spoke, my voice was cold and steady. "You want to make this right? Then help me send him to prison for the rest of his life." Mark and I filed the paperwork on a Monday morning. The comprehensive lawsuit included federal banking fraud, identity theft, forgery assault and battery conspiracy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But the civil suit was almost secondary to what mattered most, the criminal charges. The FBI had been building their case quietly for 2 weeks, ever since Mark had handed over Carol's recordings and the forensic evidence of the forged signatures. On Tuesday afternoon, I was in a client meeting when Mark texted me, "It's happening. Turn on the news." I excused myself and pulled up a live newsfeed on my phone. Federal agents were swarming my parents' house in Pennsylvania, the same house I'd grown up in. I watched them carry out boxes of documents, computers, file cabinets. Neighbours gathered on the street, filming everything on their phones. The Miller family's fall from grace was being documented in real time. My father was arrested at his lawyer's office an hour later. The prosecutor argued he was a flight risk, citing offshore accounts they discovered in the Cayman Islands, money he'd hidden from the bankruptcy proceedings. The judge denied bail. My father was led out in handcuffs, and for the first time in my life, I saw him look powerless. My mother wasn't arrested that day. Mark explained that the prosecutor was considering her as a potential witness against my father, which meant they might offer her a deal. Over the next month, the prosecution built their case with methodical precision. They had everything. The video of the assault had been viewed by over 10 million people. Forensic document experts had verified that 15 years' worth of loan applications bore forged versions of my signature. Carol's recordings proved premeditation and conspiracy. Ethan had given a deposition explaining the lifelong pattern of favoritism and manipulation, the way our father had pitted us against each other from childhood. 47 wedding guests were subpoenaed. Most cooperated immediately, eager to distance themselves from what had happened. Their testimony was damning, describing how my father had orchestrated the confrontation, how my mother had arrived with clippers already in her purse, how I'd been physically restrained while begging them to stop. The bank fraud alone was staggering. The FBI had uncovered 12 separate fraudulent loans spanning 15 years, totaling $1.2 million, all secured against my property using forged documents. 3 different banks had been defrauded. Mark told me that my father's defense attorney had approached the prosecutor privately. He wants to take a plea deal, Mark said. His lawyer told him that if this goes to trial, he'll die in prison. The evidence is overwhelming. But my father refused. He was convinced he could talk his way out of it, just like he talked his way out of everything else in his life. The night before the preliminary hearing, my phone rang at 11 p.m. Ethan. Grace, you need to call the FBI right now. His voice was panicked, breathless. I'm at the house helping Mum pack up some things, and I heard Dad on the phone in the basement. He's booking flights to Mexico under fake names. They're leaving tonight. They're running. I didn't hesitate. I called the FBI agent who'd been leading the investigation. Within minutes, I heard the calm authority in his voice. We're on it. 2 hours later, Mark sent me a news link. Federal agents had arrested my parents at the airport. They'd been in line for a midnight flight to Cancun each, carrying a single suitcase and a bag with $50,000 in cash. Fake passports were found in my father's briefcase. The media was everywhere. Cameras captured my father in handcuffs, his face twisted in rage, shouting at the agents. They captured my mother collapsing onto the airport floor, sobbing, having to be helped up by 2 female agents. The images were broadcast on every major news network within an hour. The attempted flight changed everything. The judge, who'd been considering bail for my mother, immediately revoked that possibility. Both of my parents were now being held in federal custody, pending trial. I watched the news coverage alone in my loft, my hand unconsciously touching the short stubble of hair that had started growing back. I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not even relief, just a deep, bone-tired certainty that this had to be done. My phone rang. The prosecutor. Ms. Miller, I wanted to inform you personally. The judge has set a trial date for 8 weeks from now. He paused. There's something else you should know. Your mother has requested a meeting with her attorney. She wants to testify against your father in exchange for a reduced sentence. I sat down slowly. What does that mean? It means she's willing to provide testimony about everything, the fraud, the planning, the assault, and potentially other incidents from the past. In exchange, we'd recommend a lighter sentence, probably 8 to 10 years instead of the 15 to 20 she's currently facing. And my father, with your mother's testimony added to everything else we have, he'll never see the outside of a prison again. Previous section ended with, and my father, with your mother's testimony added to everything else we have, he'll never see the outside of a prison again. Current context. 8 weeks have passed since that phone call. It's now the day of the trial. Grace's hair has grown into a short, elegant pixie cut that she's styled professionally. She's chosen to wear the same black suit she wore to the wedding, and on the talk show, a deliberate symbolic choice. She's no longer the broken woman from the wedding. She's composed strong and ready to witness justice. Mark is with her along with Ethan, who will testify. Aunt Carol is also present, though Grace doesn't yet know Carol plans to take the stand. The media attention is intense. This case has become a national story about family abuse, financial fraud, and one woman's fight for justice. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled with journalists, spectators, and people who'd followed my story from the beginning. I sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table, wearing the same black suit I'd worn to Ethan's wedding. The suit that had been on me when my mother shaved my head. It felt important to wear it again to show that I'd survived what they tried to do to me. My hair had grown back into a short pixie cut. I'd had it professionally styled yesterday, and the woman cutting it had recognised me immediately. "You're so brave," she'd whispered, tears in her eyes. I didn't feel brave. I felt tired. But I was here, and that had to count for something. Mark sat beside me, occasionally leaning over to explain legal procedures. Ethan sat on my other side, pale and silent. Aunt Carol was somewhere behind us. I'd seen her come in, but hadn't had the courage to turn around and acknowledge her yet. The prosecution built their case with methodical precision over 3 days. Forensic document experts testified about the forged signatures, showing side-by-side comparisons that made it clear my father had been systematically faking my authorization for 15 years. Bank representatives testified about the fraudulent loans. The defense tried to paint my father as a desperate man, trying to save his family business. But the numbers told a different story. Much of the money had gone to offshore accounts, luxury purchases, maintaining appearances. Then, they played the video. The full, unedited recording from the wedding. I'd seen it dozens of times by now, had watched myself being held down and humiliated in front of 200 people. But seeing it played in a courtroom with jurors watching my mother systematically remove my hair while I begged her to stop was different. Several jurors looked away. One woman in the back row was crying. My father sat at the defense table, his face impassive, showing nothing. He'd aged in the past 2 months, his hair greyer, his face more lined, but that fundamental arrogance remained. He still believed he'd find a way out of this. On the 4th day, my mother took the stand. She looked nothing like the woman who'd terrorised my childhood. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. Her hair was completely grey now she'd stopped dyeing it. She looked like she'd aged a decade in 2 months. When she was sworn in, her hand shook so badly the bailiff had to steady her. The prosecutor was gentle with her, knowing she was a cooperating witness. "Mrs. Miller, can you tell the court what your husband told you about the plan for your son's wedding?" My mother's voice was barely audible. "He said that if Grace didn't sign over the loft, we'd both go to prison. That I'd signed documents too, that I was as guilty as he was. He said we had to make her sign no matter what it took." "And did you want to do what was done to your daughter?" "No." Tears streamed down her face. "I begged him to find another way, but he said public humiliation was the only thing that would break her. That if we destroyed her credibility and her dignity in front of everyone she knew, she'd be desperate enough to give us anything." "Did you bring the hair clippers to the wedding?" A long pause. "Yes." "Why?" "Because my husband told me to, because I was afraid of him, because I thought I was protecting my son." She looked directly at me for the first time. "I was wrong. I failed as a mother to both my children. I chose fear over love, and I've destroyed everything." I sat there expressionless, watching my mother fall apart on the witness stand. Part of me wanted to feel something, pity, satisfaction, anything, but I was numb. The defense tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting she was only cooperating to reduce her own sentence. but her testimony was corroborated by too much evidence. Carol's recordings, the diaries, Ethan's testimony, the documented pattern of abuse. Then just when I thought the prosecution was finished, Aunt Carol stood up from the back of the courtroom. "Your Honour, I'd like to request permission to testify." The judge looked surprised. "You're not on the witness list." "I have evidence that's directly relevant to this case. A recording made 2 weeks before the wedding that proves premeditation and conspiracy." My father's head snapped up. His lawyer started to object, but the judge held up a hand. "I'll allow it. Approach the bench." After a brief sidebar, Carol was sworn in. She pulled out the small recording device and held it up. 2 weeks before the wedding, I hid this in the defendant's home. I recorded a conversation between Raymond Miller and his attorney about their plan for Grace. The recording played in the silent courtroom. My father's voice cold and calculating. "We'll humiliate her publicly. She'll be so desperate to escape that she'll sign anything we put in front of her." The lawyer's voice. "And if she still refuses," my father, "then we make an example of her that destroys any credibility she has. Either way, we win." The courtroom was dead silent. Several jurors were staring at my father with undisguised disgust. Even his defense attorney was looking down at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The judge removed his glasses slowly and looked directly at my father. "Mr. Miller, in 30 years on this bench, I have never encountered such calculated cruelty toward one's own child." The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, every face was set determined. The court clerk stood. "On all counts, we find the defendant, Raymond Miller, guilty." 2 weeks after the verdict, I returned to the courthouse for sentencing. The room was less crowded this time. The media circus had died down slightly, though cameras still lined the hallway outside. The judge looked at my father with an expression of profound disappointment. "Mr. Raymond Miller, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for banking fraud, forgery, identity theft, conspiracy, and assault. Given your age, it is unlikely you will ever be a free man again." My father's face remained impassive, but I saw his hands clench into fists. The judge turned to my mother. "Mrs. Margaret Miller, you are sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy and assault." Then he did something unexpected. He looked directly at both of them and continued. "You didn't just commit financial crimes. You systematically destroyed your daughter's sense of worth and safety within her own family. You taught her that love was conditional, that her value depended on her compliance, that betrayal is in some ways worse than the fraud." As they were led away, my father never looked at me. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set, refusing to acknowledge my existence, even in his final moments of freedom. My mother turned back once her eyes finding mine. Her lips moved, forming the words, "I'm sorry." I looked away. 6 months later, my life had transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined. My design firm didn't just reinstate me, they made me a partner with a public apology. My business tripled. I became known as the woman who stood alone and won, and clients sought me out not despite my story, but because of it. But the real change was something deeper. I started a nonprofit called New Foundations, offering free design services and legal resources to women leaving abusive family situations. Every Thursday evening, I hosted workshops in my loft. I'd stand in front of 15 or 20 women, all carrying their own stories of betrayal and survival, and I'd tell them, you don't need their approval, you don't need their money, you need your own foundation. Aunt Carol became my closest confidant and the nonprofit's most dedicated volunteer. We'd lost so much time, but we were building something new together. 1 year after the trial, a letter arrived from the prison where my mother was serving her sentence. I held it for a week, moving it from my desk to my kitchen counter to my nightstand, unable to decide whether to open it. Finally, on a quiet Sunday morning, I opened it. Her handwriting was shakier than I remembered. but the words were clear. She wrote about seeing my brilliance, about how my strength had terrified her, about the impossible choices my father had forced her to make. "I chose wrong," she wrote. "I chose wrong every single day for 48 years. You didn't need your father's approval or my protection. You never did." At the bottom of the envelope was a small key and a note, a safety deposit box containing her mother's jewellery and the deed to her grandmother's house now in my name only. "It was always supposed to be yours," she'd written. I held that key for a long time, tears streaming down my face. Not tears of forgiveness, I wasn't there yet, might never be there. But tears of understanding, of seeing the full complexity of who my mother had been. Now, I stand at my loft window overlooking Manhattan, holding two keys. The old one from my mother and a new one to the property I just purchased for New Foundation's permanent home. My hair has grown into a stylish cut that I actually love. I place the old key in a small glass memory box on my shelf, not to honour what was, but to remember where I came from. On the wall beside it hangs a framed quote. I designed myself, they wanted my keys. But freedom was never in my hands, it was always in my heart. I lock the memory box and slip the new key into my pocket. Aunt Carol is waiting by the door. We have a workshop to run tonight. 15 women are coming, each one carrying her own story, each one looking for the courage to build something new. I open the door to my future, leaving the past locked safely behind me. As I step into the hallway, I pause and look back at the memory box one last time. She wanted me to have the keys, I whisper. After all. Then I close the door and walk forward into the life I built, the life I earned, the life that was always meant to be mine. Thank you so much for staying with me through Grace's entire journey. I know this was a long story, but stories like this need to be told in full because healing isn't quick and justice isn't simple. Grace's story reminds us that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. That sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones we need protection from. And that no matter how alone you feel, no matter how powerless they make you believe you are, you have more strength than you know. If Grace's story resonated with you, if it made you feel something, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who tried to control you? Have you ever felt like the black sheep just because you chose a different path? Or maybe you know someone like Grace who needs to hear that it's okay to put yourself first. Share your thoughts, your stories, your reactions. This community is built on supporting each other through the hard truths that families don't always want us to talk about. And if you want to hear more stories about people who refuse to be victims, who fought back against impossible odds and won, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week, I share true stories about courage, survival, and the kind of justice that restores